Every single one of us gets anxious from time to time, but there are people for whom their anxiety is disabling. They get feelings that are so unpleasant they have to avoid situations that cause their anxiety. Today we're going to look at a time of life when anxiety often begins and is missed: childhood.
It's like an upset, sad feeling that you get when you're too worked up at something, or when you just think you haven't done good enough and you're just sad and gloomy and maybe a bit sick.
Anxiety in kids affects probably around about 5% of children. It's obviously very difficult often to decide sort of where anxiety, normal anxiety sort of starts and ends. But generally the way that we think of it is that where the anxiety starts to affect the child's life, it stops them having certain opportunities, or it stops them from getting on in the world, from doing important things like meeting other kids, going to school. That's where we'd start to say that it's become what you might call a problem, and it's worth doing something about it.
Overreaction to relatively minor things, I suppose. So as Mandy said, if you cut a piece of paper wrong, you get very upset very quickly to things that really were fairly minor issues.
I was a bit hysterical about some of my worries, and that didn't turn out very well.
Very cautious of anything new, even new food. So you'd put something new on his plate and he'd run off.
Probably the major things that parents would notice would be the avoidance and the ways in which that affects the child. So parents' lives themselves are often disrupted because the children will often get very upset when they have to do things that worry them or scare them. So good examples are, for example, a child that is scared of going to school. The parent will, of course, notice the child often having physical problems such as stomach aches or headaches whenever they've got to go to school, or they might start to cry, or in some cases even have tantrums.
To what extent does an anxious child become an anxious adult?
Anxious children are at much greater risk to become anxious adults. A relatively large proportion of the anxious children do what we'd call grow out of it. That is, they do tend to develop coping skills and strategies, and they become less anxious, or at least the anxiety stops affecting their lives as they develop. But anxious children are probably about 2 to 4 times more likely to be anxious and depressed adolescents, and then in turn anxious and depressed adolescents are 2 to 4 times more likely to become anxious depressed adults. And anxiety in childhood and teenagehood also increases the risk for other problems. I mentioned depression and also substance abuse.
Lachlan was lucky that his parents, Mandy and Grant, had insight into what he was going through and sought help for him. In other families who have an anxious child, the anxiety can be made worse by an overprotective response from the parents.
It comes very much from a sense of care about the child. So what happens is a very anxious parent, because they care so much for their child and they see the child, who themselves is anxious and distressed, in so much distress, they start to leap in earlier and earlier. And that's what we refer to as the overprotection. It's almost like a learned interaction between the parent and child, where the parent starts to anticipate what the child's going to be upset by and starts to jump in earlier and earlier to stop them from getting upset. So of course the parenting style that reduces anxiety is the opposite. It's the parenting style that is still very warm and caring and nurturing, but basically encourages and gently pushes the child to do the things that they're afraid of.
A bit hard if you're an anxious parent yourself.
Extremely.
So is the overprotective parent a person with anxiety too?
The overprotective parent is often more likely to have anxiety. It's not always the case that overprotection in a parent means that they're also an anxious parent, but they do tend to go together. We know that anxiety runs in families, and so anxious children often have anxious parents, and anxious parents, of course, do tend to be more overprotective because that anxious behaviour in the child pushes their buttons. It makes sense to them and they can relate to it, and so of course they then very quickly tend to jump in and anticipate difficulties.
To what extent does that mean then that you have to treat parents and children?
With a lot of our treatment programs we do include the parents, and we do encourage the parent to change.
The strategy is obviously really good for us as well, and I think it was quite broken into, there'd be children sessions, and then the parents would have sessions. And it's funny how then I suppose it helps you in life as well.
Tell me what you do in your programs.
Our programs tend to be very skills-based and really very common sense. One of the things that's crucial in anxiety is that people who are anxious tend to interpret situations in a very negative and very threatening way. And so what we do is we teach them how to look at the world more realistically. It's basically getting kids to look at actual evidence for whether something will or will not happen. So to give you an example, if a child is worried that after school their parent will forget them and will not turn up, and so they'll be left at school and abandoned, we'll tell them to think about the evidence for that. We'll say, think about other times. How many other times have mum or dad ever forgotten you? How many times have other kids' parents forgotten them? One of the next stages of treatment, and probably the most important part, is what we refer to as exposure technically, or we've referred to it with our clients as step ladders. And basically it involves getting the children to start to face their fears, start to do the things they're afraid of.
Can you give me an example?
So an example might be a child who's afraid of meeting other children and going up and talking to new kids at school. We might get them to think about some sorts of children who are not as scary as others. And they would practice going and talking to those children over and over and over again until they get used to it and overcome that fear. And once they've done that, then they would pick some children perhaps who are a little bit scarier.
And what sort of results do you get?
We get really good results. Our programs go for about 12 weeks. And at the end of 12 weeks, we find about 60% of their children no longer meet technical criteria for an anxiety disorder. So that means that doesn't mean that they're completely laid-back kids, but it means that they no longer have major life interference from their anxiety disorder. And that percentage goes up to 70–75% over the following sort of 3 to 12 months.
Like you start off with a pre-interview to begin with, and then you have to do some online surveys and things like that. You do a cheek swab, I think, to see if it's hereditary. So I'm guessing it is. But so it's for us, I suppose it's over as far as the group sessions, besides the interview. But obviously it's something that it's not supposed to just be a fix that happens over the 10 weeks. It's supposed to be things that you build on and use the strategies you use for the rest of your life to keep it under control.